The Detroit Pistons are entering a new era with a new president of basketball operations, and there seems to be a lot of changes on the way. What happened? What caused the Pistons to be in this position that they're in right now? We're going to talk about that in today's episode of the Locked On Pistons podcast.
You are Locked On Pistons, your daily Detroit Pistons podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's the deal? Welcome back to another episode of the Locked On Pistons podcast. Per usual, I'm your host, Kuka Hill. You can find me over on Twitter at Kuka Hill. I want to thank you guys for making Locked On Pistons your first listen of every single day. We are free and available on our podcast platforms. And if you haven't already, head to the YouTube channel at Locked On Pistons. Hit that subscribe button or leave us a 5-star review on whatever podcast platform you're listening to this on. That's another great way to support the podcast. So before we started recording this episode, I had, like I said in the cold open, I had titled it, I wanted to talk about 3 reasons why the Pistons found themselves in this position. And I wrote down in my notes the 3 segments that I wanted to go through. And as the intro was playing, I thought to myself, you know what? I'm going to call audible here, and we're going to change what this is called. I want to call this because I believe, it hasn't been announced yet, but I wholeheartedly believe that Troy Weaver's time with the Detroit Pistons is over. And at the very least, done basketball decision-making, building the Detroit Pistons. That time is done. So instead of asking the question, how did the Pistons find themselves in this position, I want to give 3 reasons why the Detroit Pistons, or why Troy Weaver failed. Why did Troy Weaver's era as the Detroit Pistons GM fail? What happened? What were the 3 biggest reasons why he now finds himself, what I believe, on the outside looking in, and a new person coming in, obviously, to make the final basketball decisions, and I think to eventually take his place and for him to move on somewhere else. So that's what we're going to talk about in today's episode. I want to hear from you guys. Let me know in the comment section down below what you guys think are the 3 biggest reasons why Troy Weaver's era in Detroit failed. But let's go ahead and get started. So my number one reason why I think Troy Weaver's era with the Detroit Pistons failed is roster construction and roster decision making. And when I say that, I added on to the decision-making part because it's not just the players that he had on the roster. It's also what he decided to do with said players on the roster. So this goes all the way back to his very first offseason with Detroit. In that first offseason with Detroit, and we've talked about this maybe a few times on the podcast. Heck, a few of the guests that we've had on over the last month and a half, they've mentioned this numerous times on the podcast, and I've kind of nodded my head. We haven't dove too much into it, but I've nodded my head and, just went along with it. But it starts his very first mistake, in my opinion, with what he did in free agency in his first offseason with the Detroit Pistons. Pistons entering an offseason rebuild, they decided, instead of taking on contracts, to take on picks. Instead of doing that, they decided to hand out contracts to Jeremy Grant, to a Mason Plumlee. Now, is Jeremy Grant a bad player? No. Is Mason Plumlee even a bad player? No. The problem is that mistake is why the Pistons find themselves, or is one of the reasons why the Pistons find themselves in 2024 with no assets. This is why they find themselves in 2024 with no extra first-round picks, no extra second-round picks. They don't have a treasure chest of assets to go, star hunting or be one of the places that, a player could arrive in because they have assets to go get them. This is why. Because instead of taking the route that a lot of rebuilding teams take at the beginning of their rebuild, when they take on bad contracts and let it soak up their cap space in order to get assets for the long haul, the Pistons didn't do that. They went and tried to get guys immediately to try to fit what they wanted to do. And was Jeremy Grant a fine signing? It 100% was, because Jeremy ended up being more than worth what he actually signed for. That moves on to the next part of it, is that he doesn't capitalize on players' values. He signed Jeremy Grant for a good deal. It looked like an overpay, but then it quickly turned into a good deal. It was rumored that they were offered 3 first-round picks by the Boston Celtics at one point. I know for a fact that there was a better deal on the table at some point than the one they accepted in the offseason when they took on that future 2025 Milwaukee Bucks first, and they ended up flipping that for an extra pick in the first round of Jane Ivey and Jalen Duren's draft. But either way, I think that right there was the very first mistake of Troy Weaver's era with the Detroit Pistons, is not taking on contracts to get assets, not prioritizing assets, and instead going and getting quote unquote his guys at a time where the Pistons weren't ready for that kind of thing. And they, even if at that point after signing Jeremy Grant, he still could have done something with it, but he didn't flip him for his max value. He held on to him until his value was lower, which is something that we saw happen a lot with Troy Weaver in his era. He held on to guys way too long, and by the time he decided to move them, their value was worse. Alec Burks, his value was worse. Bojan, his value was worse. Jeremy, his value was worse. All these guys are dudes that Troy Weaver held on to and didn't flip at their max value. And then when he did or trade them, it wasn't their max. So all of that tied into one, I think, is the biggest mistake the Pistons made, or the biggest mistake Weaver made during his time as the GM of the Detroit Pistons. And then also overall roster construction building. Like, it was just, like, it was terrible. Like, the first year was all right. It made some sense. Even the second year, even the back end of Cade's rookie season made sense. It wasn't good, but at least the team on the floor, the lineups that were on the floor, made sense. Any season since then has been terrible. The team doesn't make any sense. The lineups don't make any sense. The players surrounding Cade don't make sense. Heck, if you don't want to just isolate Cade, the players surrounding any of the young players that anyone values didn't make much sense, especially this past offseason when they punted on this past offseason basically by taking on Joe Harris's contract. And again, this is another example. They took on Joe Harris's contract when you didn't even take it on for anything. You got what, a second round pick? Like, you don't get anything for that. And he was completely unplayable. So the roster construction, not getting spacing on the floor, not prioritizing getting 3-and-D wings. The Pistons have lacked wings for like over a decade, and it's been a problem, continued problem. It's just the roster construction, asset management, all of that is the biggest reason I believe that Troy Weaver finds himself on the cutting board right now. It's by far the biggest reason to me. If he would have done a better job at surrounding Cade and heck, Ivy and Duren, whatever, this offseason, I don't know if this season goes much better. Actually, it does go a little better, but I don't know how much better. But I can guarantee he probably still has his job right now. Like, he would probably be on the hot seat, but he would still have his job at this point. Like, they wouldn't be firing him outright. But because of the massive mistake he made in roster construction this past offseason, then going all the way back to the very first offseason when he decided not to get them assets to dig themselves out of a potential situation like they find themselves in right now, is the main reasons for me that Troy Weaver is finding himself on his way out the door in Detroit. So let me know what you guys think is the number one reason why Troy Weaver finds himself, losing all basketball decision-making, and it's looking like he's going to lose any kind of job in Detroit completely. Let me know what you guys think. Comment section down below or over on Twitter at Cougar Hill. When we come back, the second reason why I think the Pistons find themselves in this situation and why Troy Weaver finds himself going out the door, we'll talk about that when we come back. Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time, or you'll get your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts that you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers at ebaymotors.com. So I want to thank you guys again for making Locked On Pistons your first listen of every single day. Free available on all your podcast platforms. If you haven't already, head to the YouTube channel at Locked On Pistons. Hit that subscribe button or leave us a 5-star review on whatever podcast platform you're listening to this on. That's another great way to support the podcast. So, reason number two, why I believe Troy Weaver is about to lose his job and why the Pistons find themselves in this position. And this is an uncomfortable conversation to have, but I mean, it's one of the reasons why. A lack of development from within. The Pistons And there's a little bit more layers than you maybe think to this, but just on the surface is that the Pistons' young guys have not developed as quickly or as much as anyone in Detroit really wanted. Not just Troy Weaver, but fans, teammates, coaches. It just haven't. They have not developed at the rate that they probably wanted them to. So if you go all the way back to 2020, the first draft of Troy Weaver's era, he got Killian Hayes at number 7. Not even on the team. Got waived this past offseason. He also got Sadiq Bey, no longer on the team. Traded to Atlanta. Isaiah Stewart, fine pick. But in the Isaiah Stewart trade, or by drafting Isaiah Stewart, I should say, he had to trade a future first-round pick that is now tied up for the Pistons for multiple years ahead, which kind of makes some of their flexibility a little bit handicapped. Now, they can trade first-round picks way, way down the line, but it does make it a little bit tricky trying to do it now because they owe a future first-round pick to the New York Knicks. Now, initially it was to the Houston Rockets, but then it got flipped around, and now it's with the New York Knicks. So, in order to get the Isaiah Stewart deal, which was a fine pick, he ended up giving a future asset up. And I wonder if we asked Pistons fans, hey, would you have done that trade and given up that first-round pick that the Pistons have given up and in the position they find themselves in, would you still do it all over again? Is Isaiah Stewart good enough for you to want to be in the position that they found themselves over the last few years with that future first-round pick tied up? I really would wonder how Pistons fans would feel about that. But that first draft, Killian Hayes did not develop at all. Sadiq Bey regressed, got worse, I'd say, as a shooter. Stayed pretty poor as a defender and developed some bad habits. They didn't do a good job developing him. They put him in some situations that allowed him to develop bad habits and to a point where they had to move on from him. That you can attribute that to coaching. You can attribute that to culture set by the GM, by the front office, all of it. That first round, I think that first round in 2020 was a complete wash. Actually, maybe not complete wash because, again, Stu is fine. But, to have 3 first-round picks in a draft that featured Tyrese Halliburton, Devin Vassell, where's Tyrese Maxey, Emmanuel Quickley, in a draft, Desmond Bane, in a draft with those guys, you don't end up with any of them, and all the other stuff I just mentioned. That started off everything. Terrible development and decision-making at that part. Now you move on to the next draft. Obviously, you got Cade Cunningham. I think that was the hit. Isaiah Livers moved off the team. Didn't really develop. Was injury-prone, but moved off the team. And obviously, that late second-round pick, Luka Garza. I'm not going to hold that against him. It's the 52nd pick. So there you have that draft class. Cade's gotten better. We like Cade. But Isaiah Livers, early second-round pick, didn't pan out. He's off the team. Move on to the next draft class. You got Jaden Ivey. And Jaden Ivey's a soft spot for this community, apparently. But Jaden Ivey has not developed as how you probably would like him. After his rookie season, a lot of people were expecting a big jump. And in a lot of areas, Jaden Ivey took a step back his second season. Defensively, he still struggles. He's not a good shooter. He got worse as a shooter this past year. Remains a poor decision maker with the ball in his hands, turns the ball over a ton, and he's still not a very good finisher around the basket, despite his athletic gifts. That's Jaden Ivey. Then you got Jalen Duren, who also, he took a step forward offensively, but defensively he's so bad that no one even cares about it. And some people would argue he developed some bad habits this past year. Either way, not even just talking about what they are right now, where they were from rookie year to second year is not what a lot of Pistons fans bet on. And you can guarantee it's not what the front office bet on, because that's why they didn't do any moves this past offseason, because they were betting on internal development and they thought these guys would take jumps and that would save them from having a terrible season. Well, guess what? They didn't. They took a step backwards, I would say, in a lot of areas, and they ended up losing 28 games in a row. So internal development amongst those guys did not happen. It didn't happen how they'd wanted to so far. Now, that doesn't mean they can't develop in 2 years from now, but so far, the lack of development, the lack of having anyone take that a quick jump is what doomed this team. Because it was very quickly identified, I'd say, that what this front office wanted was to win with their guys, to win with the guys Troy Weaver identified. And in order for that to happen, someone was going to have to take a jump in the development process. And none of them did. None of them did. Again, Jaden Ivey and Jalen Duren may improve in the future. This is not talking about them in the future. What caused the Pistons and Troy Weaver's era to fail is that they bet on internal improvement happening very quickly, happening faster than it did. Killian Hayes didn't develop, he got waived. Sadiq Bey didn't develop, he got traded. Isaiah Livers didn't develop, he got traded. Jaden Ivey didn't develop. They had a terrible season this past year, and he sounds like he might be traded this offseason. Jalen Duren, he didn't develop as quickly as you want to on the defensive end, and it sounds like he might be traded this offseason. Like that is the main reason why the Detroit Pistons, or the second main reason why Troy Weaver's era failed. He bet on his own picks, he bet on his young guys, and it didn't happen. And those are just the draft picks. Remember, I said there's multiple layers to this. Then you move on to the second chance guys that he took chances on. Josh Jackson, did he pan out? No. I actually thought Josh Jackson was getting better his first year in Detroit, but then after that, it kind of, I don't know, he'd be stagnated, but there was a flash there, but it is what it is. But Josh Jackson, did he take a step forward? No. He didn't develop. He's not on the team no more. They took a chance on Jahlil Okafor. You remember that? You guys remember that one? That didn't work. You guys remember Marvin Bagley? Yeah, he got traded. That didn't work out. You guys remember James Wiseman? Hey, yeah, that didn't work out. They took chances on multiple guys. Killian Hayes was probably the home run swing. They went with the guy with the higher ceiling, and they said, we can develop him. Guess what? They didn't. They traded for James Wiseman because they have him number 2 on their board a few years ago. Thought he had a high ceiling. Did they develop him? Hell no. He's not going to be on the team next year. Same thing with Marvin Bagley. Second overall pick. We can develop him. We can make him who we want. He's great. He gets here. Guess who got traded later on? Jahlil Okafor, another top pick. We can develop him. We can prove that he can be a player. Guess what? No, they didn't. Josh Jackson, another player, top overall pick. We like him. We can flip his career around. Did they do it? Absolutely not. They didn't get development from the guys they drafted. They didn't get development from the guys that they traded for, they bet on. They didn't get development from any of those guys. And then to put the cherry on top, they didn't get development from any, or they didn't hit any diamonds in the rough and then develop the diamonds in the rough from two-way contracts, from 10-day contracts, no G League guys. If you look across teams across the league, you will see. I brought up Jose Alvarado. I thought it was a really good find by the New Orleans Pelicans a few episodes ago. But if you go throughout the NBA, just looking through each team, a lot of teams have found, not saying they had to be stars, but rotation players. They find NBA players on two-way deals, on G League deals, on 10-day deals. They find people. The Pistons didn't find any of those. All the guys that they handed two-way contracts out, Buddy Boeheim, like all of these dudes that they gave these contracts to, none of them stuck. None of them developed, and none of them actually became NBA players. So quite literally, Troy Weaver struck out in every possible way when it came to development. In every facet that you can go through each layer, he struck out. I didn't even think it was possible to strike out on all three, but he struck out on all of them. He struck out so far. Now, again, Jalen Duren, Jaden Ivey, they may develop in the future, but so far through 4 years, and what dug Troy Weaver in, he bet on them developing quickly. It didn't happen. The other guys in 2020, they didn't develop quickly. It didn't happen. Isaiah Livers, it didn't happen. So the guys he drafted didn't develop quick enough for him. So he struck out there. And those guys may not even be on the team. The only one that may be left on the team next year is Kay Cunningham. Like, that is a real possibility. So struck out there with his own drafted guys. When it comes to the guys he went and signed in free agency, like a Josh Jackson, like a Jahlil Okafor, like those guys, he struck out there as well. Well, when it comes to guys that he traded for with high draft pedigree, that he took chances on, that he had number 2 on his board and thought he could turn around, those guys, he struck out there as well. None of them are going to be on the team. And then when you talk about two-way contracts, 10-day contracts, G League guys, remember the whole stuff about the G League? That they're going to use the G League to the utmost. They want to move it to Detroit because now they're going to be sending them down the street and they can use it as the developmental center. My goodness, I said center. Center. They didn't do that. They struck out literally on every single level. Like, honestly, it's impressive, the fact that how badly they struck out on almost every level. And I'm not going to lie to you guys. If it was not for the Pistons being gifted the number 1 overall pick in Cade, I don't know how much worse it could have got. Because literally, if any honest Pistons fan, anyone who covers the team, you look at this team, you look at what people say outside Detroit, the ones who are writing nationally about the Pistons, Bleacher Report, ESPN, all the reports. Anytime you talk about the Pistons' job before they hired Trajan, it was, well, they got Cade. Like that is what most people are saying outside Detroit. If they did not get the number 1 overall pick, I don't know what would have happened because they didn't hit nowhere else. They didn't hit on the trades for those guys. They didn't hit on the two-way guys. They didn't hit on the draft picks. They didn't hit on did I already say the trades for the high pedigree guys? Like, they didn't hit on literally any of it. So along with the roster construction, along with not capitalizing on assets, along with not prioritizing future assets in free agency his first go around, you add on this, those are the two main reasons why the Detroit Pistons find themselves in this position and why Troy Weaver is going to lose his job. Because he struck out at every single angle. I like looking back at it, it's honestly impressive how bad it went. It is what it is. They couldn't develop anybody. And that's been a problem for the Pistons for years, but they couldn't develop anybody. The guys that they took a chance on, they couldn't develop them. The guys they drafted, they couldn't develop. It was just like struck out everywhere. Completely struck out. 1, 2, 3 strikes, you're out. So that's my second reason. Let me know in the comment section down below. What do you guys think about that? Do you guys agree, disagree? When we come back, my final reason, which is I think the biggest thing, if there was anything that I want or Pistons fans should want out of Trajan Langdon, it is this right here. You'll find out what I'm talking about when we come back. So I want to thank you guys again for making Locked On Pistons your first listen of every single day. Free and available on all podcast platforms. If you haven't already, head to the YouTube channel at Locked On Pistons. Hit that subscribe button or leave us a 5-star review. Or whatever podcast platform you're listening to this on, there's another great way to support the podcast. The final reason why the Detroit Pistons find themselves where they're at and why Troy Weaver finds himself heading out the door is a lack of vision. If you look at this roster right now, and you can throw coaching into this too, but if you look at this roster and you look at the roster throughout the 4 years, what was the Pistons' identity? What was the vision with this team? Can anyone actually make what the vision for this team was all this time? Because I can't. All that I saw was take best player available, which I don't disagree with, but take best player available and just keep it going. I didn't see any, like, at the beginning of this year, it looked like that they are going to try to go the identity of, we are going to be a defensive team. We're going to start Killian Hayes. We're going to start Asar Thompson. We're going to start Isaiah Stewart all together. We're going for a defensive identity. Our offense may struggle at times, but we are going to play defense. We are going to then get out in transition, and we're going to clamp down the half court. That's what we're going to do. And for the first 10 or so games, that's what it looked like they were going to try to do. They had like a 2-8 record, which it wasn't great, but at least then you could say, okay, we see what they want to be. We see what they're trying to build towards. We see their vision. We see their ideology. That's what they're wanting to do. But then after that 10 games, they went the complete opposite. They said, screw defense, and they went full offense. Which, again, I'm not saying whether the full defense route was right. I'm not saying whether the full offense route is right. I'm saying the lack of a vision that everyone from top down agreed on was not there, and that's one of the reasons why they've been in this position and why Troy Weaver's out the door. It felt like throughout the 4 years of covering this team, and I say covering this team because I've been the host of this podcast since the first year of the rebuild. Since the first year. My first episode, I believe, was April of 2020, I believe. That was the first year because I covered the end of Killian's rookie season and then covered the draft for Kate. All these years, I can say as someone who's covered the team, one of the main things I've said, and one of the things that have been a little bit of a pet peeve, is that I don't know what they're trying to build towards. I don't know what their idea is. What is their identity that they're going for? And when you don't have that, I think one of the main reasons why they didn't have that, I should say, is because they couldn't get an agreement from top to middle to bottom across the organization. There's too many cooks in the kitchen. There's too many voices. And no one could agree on one sole vision. Because there were some moves that were made that didn't make sense with other moves. And there were some off seasons where lack of moves didn't make sense with other moves. For example, getting Asar Thompson at the 5th overall pick. That's best player available. That's what they believe is best player available. They took the home run swing. I get it. That's fine. But it was always one move, and then the next moves didn't make sense to make that move make sense. So you take Asar, who's a non-shooter, okay, we're taking a home run swing, but in order, I feel like anyone who scouted Asar, and if you watch my episodes when I was scouting Asar and why I had Asar ranked so highly, if you were to draft Asar, you immediately need to make sure you have spacing around him. You need to have spacing, not just around him. It's not just like you're building around Asar, but if you have him on the floor, there needs to be spacing. If you're going to draft Asar, you need to have spacing. And all we heard that offseason was they were going to address spacing. Did they address spacing? Absolutely not. The Pistons took some of the least amount of threes in the NBA this past year. They were one of the worst three-point shooting teams in the entire NBA. They didn't have any spacing. So why draft Asar if you then weren't going to build a team with spacing? Because now you're not only just hurting Asar, you're hurting Cade, you're hurting Ivy, you're hurting Duren, you're hurting Stu, you're hurting everyone that was on the team. Everyone's hurting now because you took a player that didn't fit what your current roster was, and you did nothing to try to maximize it. You can go through each off season that they had where it was like you make one move, you feel like, okay, that was one vision. And then the next move you make, you feel like that was a completely different vision. You feel like that wasn't Troy Weaver's vision, or maybe that was Troy Weaver's vision, then this one wasn't his vision. Like, they never, at any point did I feel like, looking back on it, never at any point did I feel like that they had one unified vision. From everyone in the front office, from everyone in the ownership, to the coaching staff, it never once felt like to me that the Pistons had a unified vision for what they wanted this team to become, what they were building towards, and what the end goal was. And that is the third biggest reason for me why the Pistons find themselves here and why Troy Weaver is going to lose his job. So let me know in the comment section down below how you guys feel about that. Do you guys agree, disagree? Do you guys have any other reasons why they find themselves in this position 4 years later? Why Troy Weaver's era in Detroit is going to be a failure? Let me know in the comment section down below or over on Twitter at Kookie Hill. That's all I've got for you guys today. Thank you guys for making Locked On Pistons your first listen of every single day. We're free and available on all your podcast platforms. Hit that subscribe button to the YouTube channel. Leave us a 5-star review, whatever podcast platform you're listening to this on. That's another great way to support the podcast. And until next time, I'll see you guys later. Stay safe out there. Until next time, peace out.